Dialogues for Justice. And this is our conference on From Conflict to Community, Meaningful Action that brings us together rather than tears us apart. And this is our Meet the Authors session. We have 4 great authors for you to meet and dialogue with. I'm really excited. Their books are prophetic, powerful, and really used by God. So I'm excited to hear from them directly. And so I'll introduce each of the authors now. They're going to take turns maybe reading samples from their books. And let me welcome them and introduce them now. Our first author will be, do I need to introduce you? Lisa Sharon Harper. She's the founder and president of freedomroad.us, and her new book is entitled Fortune: How Race Broke My Family and the World, and How to Repair It All. And it was just released this week, so you guys are getting the brand new spanking release of the book. We also have Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley, who with his wife is a co-sustainer of the Eloe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice, and he'll be sharing about his new book, Becoming Rooted: 100 Days of Reconnecting with Sacred Earth. Third, we have Rob Dalrymple. He is executive director of Determined Truth Ministries, a 501c3 parachurch ministry, and he'll be reading from his book, These Brothers of Mine. And finally, we have Robin Afric, a DEI director in Ottawa County, and she'll be reading from her anthology called Becoming Like Reals. So we'll start off with Lisa and invite you to share. Thank you very much.
So much, Russell. And Russell has asked us to share about 5 minutes of our work. And so 5 minutes from the book. So I'm going to read directly from Fortune. And I'm going to read a passage that I'm actually going to skip through it because it's a little bit longer than 5 minutes. So I'm going to cut out a part of it. One part that you might be more familiar with, which is messaging from the Very Good Gospel that's kind of in this. So Americans like to contain racism by thinking of it as a problem of hatred, but it is rarely about hatred. Fortune's story shows us the roots of American racialization. Race was fundamentally a project of law to enforce a political view of the world, one where white men inhabit the top rung on the ladder of human hierarchy, but that ladder is not merely about status. It's more than that. It's about control. Through the acquisition of land and money, the sin of slavery is domination. Motivated by insatiable lust for power and status, European men acquired power through the acquisition of land and cash. Slavery was simply the means to their desired end. Repairing our broken world will require people of European descent to repent from striving for godlike control of all creation. People deemed white have warred against God for supremacy, declaring that they too have the authority to define human beings, land rights, even God. They declared some people to be, quote, savages, and so they were according to the law. They declared some people to be, quote, 3/5 of a human being, and so they were according to the law. They declared some to be, quote, chattel, and so they were according to the law. Europeans' domination of images of God across the planet has waged a world war against the dominion of God. Repentance will require people of European descent to face this truth. Repentance will require people deemed white to lay down distorted lenses crafted for them by parents and grandparents, stories, history books, museums, and media. Repair for the ones who broke the world will require that they renounce the lie that whiteness is inherently good, inherently noble, and inherently right. Repeated lies distort perception, making it difficult to see reality. The lie of white goodness wore down the capacity for empathy, moving people deemed white into a series of knee-jerk justifications, crafted to cordon off emotion from the requirements of progress, white progress. Speaking with Bob Zellner, veteran organizer with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a white man, I asked, what drove white people to fight to the death to maintain white supremacy? He shared with me his theory of the shrunken heart. First of all, slavery was an act of war, he said. It had to be carried out every day against Black people in order to maintain the kind of plantation systems that we had under slavery. We had to commit acts of war and violence every day against Black people. Slavers used frightful iron shackles, dehumanizing torture, masks, branding irons, and they cut off ears and limbs for obstinate behavior and committed serial rape because this was war. For centuries, Zellner said, through slavery and later through Jim Crow and the sharecropper economic system in the South, white Southerners had to constantly suppress their own feelings of sympathy and empathy for another human being. In the same way that farm chicken had to, sorry, in the same way that farm chicken had to steel themselves when the farm children had to steel themselves when the chicken had its neck wrung, or the calf was killed, or the rabbit was knocked on the head. So you could have it for supper. They had to have no feelings for that animal. In the same way, they had to have no feelings for that enslaved person or that person of color. For centuries, white people have shrunken their own hearts. End quote. Distorted lenses offer a cover for licentiousness. David Ballard was a Quaker. He and his descendants went against their own Quaker consciousness to build their Southern empire, or else they abandoned Quakerism altogether in exchange for status. Ballard and his descendants bought and sold people. They separated babies from their mothers and fathers. Children, mothers, and fathers were raped in the process of securing comfort for Ballard. Children, mothers, and fathers died doing Ballard's work. Leah bore down and screamed her first daughter, Martha, into the world in 1865. Martha passed through the contractions of both mother and country. She breathed her first gulp, then a scream burst from her body, a scream that equaled the terror of moving from the safety of the womb into a world ablaze. Martha Ballard was born to a woman who had known only slavery. Martha and her descendants would know only freedom, to a point. Born as the Civil War folded to a close, there is no listing of Martha's exact date of birth. The 1880 census only discloses the year of her birth, 1865. Listed as one of 9 mulatto children of Leah Ballard, neither mother nor child can be found on any census before 1880. Martha's first 15 years of life and Leah's plight directly following emancipation remain shrouded in history. Leah Ballard Ankrum Williams was a woman for whom the putrid taste of antebellum loss had become familiar. That loss followed Leah throughout her first 19 years, and its ghost haunted her in every generation till the day she died. The same year that Leah gave birth to Martha, our nation pushed the 13th Amendment from passage to ratification within 12 months. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. These words catalyzed the reversal of the original Virginia laws established in 1662, as well as every race law that bound Fortune and her descendants, the laws that bound Henry and his brothers, and the South Carolina laws that shackled generations of Leah's family and would have bound them forever. I can only imagine Leah's tears and dancing on the day she learned she was free. To think of the joy now, my body cannot contain it. Leah would taste loss again, but for this moment, I imagine Leah standing still on the land she and her people had slaved for generations. On the day she hears that she is free, Leah raises her face to the noonday sun. She looks up to the trees, the leaves blowing and swaying overhead. Leah remembers the sound of the spirit songs in the brush arbor. She remembers her mother's voice in the trees. She listens close, and soon she hears the harmonies of her foremothers all the way back to the Yoruba and Hausa women. They sing to her from the trees. Put on your crown, child. Put on your crown. I came this night for to sing and pray, oh yes, to drive old Satan far away, oh yes, that heavenly home is bright and fair, oh yes, but very few can enter there, oh wait till I put on my crown, wait till I put on my crown, wait till I put on my crown, oh yes. If you want to catch that heavenly breeze, oh yes, go down in the valley on your knees. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Go bow your knees upon the ground. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And ask your Lord to turn you round. Oh, yes. Oh, wait till I put on my robe. Wait till I put on my robe. Wait till I put on my robe. Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Amen. Thank you, Lisa. I'm speechless. So let's all give Lisa and Jesus a hand for that. But thank you so much. Can you explain why you wrote the book and what you hope for it? We've been discussing today moving from conflict to community, and your book speaks about that, about how we need to repair from the sin of control and the sin of racism. So can you share a little bit about your motivations?
Well, my motivation for writing the book, it began 30 years ago when I started my family research. And I started my family research simply because I'm African American and there are huge gaps in our knowledge and our understanding and even in our capacity to know. So, and that's simply because there were laws passed literally in the colonial era, in the early colonial era, early 1700s, that declared that they just would not keep records for Black people, people of African descent. And they said they didn't give any justification except it's not worth the effort. Literally, that's what it says in the law, not worth the effort. And so from that point forward, records were not kept, except in now you can find them in wills, in diaries. I was looking for Fortune's daughter, Sarah. I was looking for more evidence of who she was indentured to, who she might have been passed to in the course of her indenture, and I didn't actually find that document. But I was reading about a Sarah who was indentured in the 1700s to a woman in the Foote family, where Sarah was actually indentured. She was indentured to Anne Fuchs, and so, but this was not that person. And so this person though willed an indentured servant, mixed race indentured servant like Sarah, to her daughter and passed her down with her bed. So as I was reading the will, I thought, my God, like this this is this is disturbing. My and I didn't know at the time it wasn't my ancestor, but my ancestor might have been passed down with a bed to the next generation. And that happened all the time because those are the documents that now you can actually trace your ancestry through. I wrote the book. I decided to write the book when I began to realize that generation after generation was living in the middle of particular eras where the laws of race were constructed, the rules of race were constructed. Very, very significant moments in American race history. So then I realized this is not just my story. This is America's story of race. And I said, it has to be told. So let's tell it.
Thanks. And I'm glad you're sharing it. The erasure of our stories, right, is something that needs to be addressed. And so we're grateful for your research and sharing of it. Are there any questions from the audience for Lisa? You can put it in the chat or Q&A.
Can I just add this real quick, Russell? It's just to say that one of the goals now for this work is that people would read it, that they would go deep into their own family stories, and that it would motivate us to understand we can repair this. There were a series of choices that were made over the course of 500 years. 400 where African Americans were on the soil, but 100 years before that with indigenous people. We made choices about how the polis would live together. And those choices are what haunt us today. Those choices led to January 6th and are leading to the evisceration of voting rights right now and gerrymandering. But they don't have to. We can make different choices about how we live together in the world.
Well, to wrap up, can you give us some examples of how you think we could make that repair of what we should do as a church and as individuals?
Sure. First, we can go into our own stories. That's the first thing. We need to seek the truth. And I think that the best way for us to do that is to seek the truth about your own family's story. Secondly, we need to actually listen to the truth, listen from our elders, listen from people of color who have actually borne the brunt of American oppression. Third, we need to tell the truth that we hear. And then we need to actually make efforts, make actions, take action to reverse course and offer reparations. And the process of reparation is actually as important as that final whatever it will be, the check or whatever, because the process has to heal the relationship that was broken between the people groups. And the relationship broke the moment that that first colonial settler came onto the continent of Africa and imagined that they should be the ones ruling there and that they had the right to steal their people and use them for their own economic gain. And so that needs to be reversed by then going to the people who were oppressed and asking, what do you say we need to do in order for things to be made well with you? In the line of David and what he did with the Gibeonites in 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 14. So, and then finally, forgiveness. Those of us who have suffered on the underside of oppression, in order for us to be well, in order for us to heal, there has to be a measure of releasing the other from their debt to us, because they just don't have all of what is needed to pay it. And if we demand that debt to be paid until the day we die, we will die in want. But God is the God with a cattle on 1,000 hills, who moves mountains. So we can go to God and we can say, all right, God, it's time for you to ante up, move the mountain, fill the debt. And it's God's pleasure to do that because we are God's children.
Thank you, Lisa. So read her book. It's called Fortune. It talks about how we can repair our nation. And the repair really is for those, is a call to repentance. And that forgiveness is our way to freedom for us as people of color. So thanks a lot, Lisa. We'll now turn to Randy and his book. Randy is an Indigenous scholar and activist, and his book is entitled Becoming Rooted. So Randy, please share.
Yeah, so I just want to take a second and just say that because Rob and I just met today for the first time, but I have known Lisa for almost 20 years now, and I have the advanced reader copy of the book. I was fortunate enough to get to do a little cultural consultation with her on it. And this is an incredible book, an incredible story. I love the way it reads. It's a narrative, and it's just what we need. It's stories that tell the truth. And so, I'm happy to recommend that. And I didn't even realize that Robin and I just met today, but she's one of the authors of another book I got an advanced reader copy because I endorsed it. Curtis, the lead author, is a friend of mine. And Sarah has been to our farm out in Newburgh. She's an incredible human being. And Mickey Scott Bay Jones, Mickey, she was one of my students in a master's program. She always says that she was my favorite student, and I just tell her, you're all my favorite student. But incredible person and writers, and just enjoyed this book so much. And this book also has so many important things to say. So I just, I can't recommend at least, the two people who I know who wrote it, and I got advanced copies of enough. They're just great books. So big endorsement for me, if that means anything to you. So this book, Becoming Rooted, 100 Days Reconnecting with Sacred Earth. I'm going to read a couple. They're just very short bites out of, and I kind of picked one from each section. There's 100 different reflections. They all begin with a quote from some person, not necessarily famous, but and then they end with a sort of an action point. So this one is just number 3, the third entry out of 100, and it's called Sacred Sleep sacred water. Also, I hate to follow Lisa because she has a background in acting and writing and directing, and she is absolutely one of the best voices out there for reading books. So here comes the old man after the pro. So anyway, it says this. William Shakespeare said, "And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything." Sacred water, sacred sleep. When I was a teenager growing up in the land of the Anishinaabe, I had a secret spot I would go to, and when I was hunting or just when I needed solace. About 9 a.m, when the warmth of the sun was winning the battle over the cold air left from the night before, I would make my way down to the creek where it exited the woods and joined a small field. The open space between the two sections of woods was just wide enough to allow the heat from the sun to become a true force before the trees shadowed it out. There I would lie, allowing the earth to hold me in her warm embrace. I would close my eyes and listen to the gurgle of the creek. Those sacred moments often turn into calm sleep. That was deep and peaceful, but not quiet. Sleeping in the bosom of nature is not the same as sleeping in the safety of one's own bed. Not at all. As you lay your body down to become one with the earth, reality shifts. In that state, you can sense that God, Creator, is listening to the intentions of your heart. Whatever the mysterious power is behind creation, it softens one's mind. Great mystery unscrews the tight lids of the jars of certainty that you hold too tightly, too fiercely. You realize, sometimes even trembling, that something greater than yourself is meeting you. There, in the restful unknown world between sleep and wakefulness, you give yourself to those moments, to those elements, to spirit, to the kind of vulnerability a newborn in the world must experience. As I doze off to sleep in that realm of sacred beauty next to that stream, I listened to how the water responded to each rock, to how every branch protruded from the creek bank, and to the swirl of every curve as it meandered past me into some other creature's nap. With each contact, the water had a particular note and registry of sound. Over the rocks, around the curve, and down the path of its sacred water journey, sacred sleep, sacred water, sacred life. Who listened to the land before you and your people arrived? How do you imagine that they experience these sacred moments? I'm going to just read one more. I don't want to take up too much time, but this one is a little a bit exercise of humility for me. Some of these are more personal than others, and I tell about myself. This one's called Duck, Duck, Goose, and it's an experience I had. Dorothy Dix said, "We are never happy until we learn to laugh at ourselves." One of the strangest things that has ever occurred and I'd ever seen during my first visit to the Stewart Indian Reservation in Nevada, where I pastored for 7 years. It happened just weeks after we had arrived at Carson City, Nevada. It was cold and a sunny day, and Edith and I were going for a walk with our kids in tow in the local neighborhood. We were just walking by the houses on the reservation, hoping to meet some people and introduce ourselves as the new pastor and family of the neighborhood church. The first person we saw standing out in her yard, looking as though she wanted to meet us, it turns out she was a Washoe Tribal Council member. As we were making our introductions, starting a conversation, we began to hear this strange racket coming out of the sky. We all looked up, and together we saw a very unexpected spectacle. Almost directly above us was a flock of Canadian geese, a very common sight for that time of year. What was different about this particular group was that at the front of the flock was a male mallard duck. He was frantically trying to squeeze in as the leader in the front of that large V of geese. The display immediately brought on wonder, which turned quickly into hilarity. Edith and I and our children and our new friend laughed together at that duck's self-inflicted attempts at leadership. It was obvious to all of us that there was no way this move was going to work out in the duck's advantage. As an outsider finding myself in leadership role in the community, I heard that message loud and clear. Don't be like that duck. And perhaps the second message, or even more importance, don't take yourself too seriously. I sometimes wonder, why does the rest of the community of creation, what do they think of us as humans? Are they laughing at us? Do they see us take ourselves much too seriously? I learned much about humility from that encounter, mostly not to take myself too seriously and to always make the point of listening to others. Find the things in nature that make you laugh at yourself, and what might other creatures find amusing about you?
Thanks, Randy. Now I want to go take a nap in the woods and then just laugh at myself. Like we asked Lisa, why did you write this book, and in the style that you did? The 100 reflections and moments to reconnect. And I also noticed that, it wasn't explicitly Christian, or a lot of times you didn't. Oh, I don't know. I didn't read through the whole thing, how much you included scriptures. So can you share about that? And you also have a question in the chat that I'll ask afterwards.
Yeah. So I'll take the second thing first, which is I chose to write it because when we talk about the earth, it doesn't exclude anybody from that spirituality. As Native people, our own spirituality really starts with the earth. And I would say as human beings, it does too, but the West has just forgotten that. And so this leads me to the second thing, which is people need to be, even our indigenous people need to be reminded that we are all spiritual people, and being human makes us spiritual, not being, trying to be something above being human, but God made us human. And the more earthly we are, I think the more spiritual we are, because God gave us the earth and the whole community of creation, nature, as people say, as our first and longest lasting teacher. And so we are to learn from nature, if you will. I wrote the book because normally most people who know me as sort of somebody who tackles things head on. I've got a couple books out there. I've got one coming out in April called Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, where I deal with the philosophical things and all those kinds of theological things. But this book, I just wanted to, my project, it's not hidden. My wife and I's project, our lifelong project, is to decolonize people from a Western worldview and help them find a more indigenous worldview for themselves. And so this one, I wanted to write it in a way that would invite anybody to any religion, any faith, any spiritual person who considers spirituality important, or even if you don't, to just travel along with what I hope is an indigenous worldview for 100 days. And maybe in that 100 days, they might begin to see the world differently, or even if they just use it for a little devotion or something like that, if they think about it long enough and maybe do the things that it says at the end of each entry, that it might break up that strong sense of that the West has created this really foilable, terrible worldview I call the Western worldview, that's gotten us in so much trouble in so many places, and help them develop a more indigenous worldview. And you do that through story, and you do that through experience. And so that's what I share in here is story and experience. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that gift. And that sort of leads to Terry's question in the Q&A. As we seek to decolonize, both you and Lisa talk about how we need to go back to our ancestors. But Terry writes that for some people, tracing back to our ancestors could lead to more nationalistic, tribal, patriarchal, sexist perspectives, depending on who our ancestors are. So how do we bring back something that is broken, and how do we make it better? Any suggestions?
Yeah.
As we retrieve and reclaim.
Yeah. When I talk about looking to our indigenous ancestors, because I talk about the whole introductions about like we're all indigenous from somewhere, given time and space. Indigenous people knew how to live with the land. And so I'm not saying go back and copy them or, do everything they did, but I'm saying that everybody has in their own epigenetics a sense of how to live with the land as a group. And so we need to recall that. We need to get in touch with that. And I think that's what I mean when I talk about that. So Lisa will have to speak for that. But I think the other thing is that, as I look back on my own ancestry, I have lots of things to be proud of and lots of things that I'm not very proud of. And that's just the reality. This, we don't live in a utopia, and we never have. I don't think there's any such thing. But we do live in a world that's full of good and bad and lots of things in between, it seems. And so, we just have to sort through all that, just like we do anything else in life.
Thanks, Randy, for the wisdom. Lisa?
I just want to add, first of all, Randy, thank you so much for that reading. I literally sat with my dog Babe on my lap, and we just listened. It was so good. I felt like I was laying in the brush. So thank you. I think that we have to understand the call to look backwards in order to go forwards in light of the context that we're sitting in, the philosophical context, because I think that part of the reason why we are captured right now by whiteness and blackness is because of the impetus toward empire and domination. The thinking behind empire was actually benign, not benign. It was benevolent, not benign, but benevolent. They thought we can achieve peace through domination. That was actually the thought behind the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the English Empire, the whole thing. English Empire, hailed itself as having achieved a great thing through the Commonwealth, right? Through the reality that the sun never set on England. So they thought of themselves as building peace throughout the world. But and the project of race actually has done something very similar in America for people of European descent. People who used to be at war with each other on the continent of Europe, suddenly when they get to America, they're all just white. So they then have some level of peace between them, and they get to be on top. So they get to be the noble class of Europe because they're not on the underside. But you know what that does is it dehumanizes everybody else, and ultimately dehumanizes people of European descent as well, because it disconnects them from their actual people's story. So what they have to gain through the process of re-indigenization, in other words, through the process of reconnecting with their ancestors' story, is actually their reconnection to their humanity. Now, what they did in Europe when they established the whole imperial project was domination, also, of course, included hierarchies of human belonging. So the thought, the imagination that to go back to your ethnic roots would then immediately necessitate ethnic enmity and ethnic hierarchy is one that comes out of European experience, but it's not necessarily everyone's experience. And it's not necessarily, it is not necessary. We were created as human beings. And God had us in ethnic groups, had the imagination to have us in groups that went all over the world. And our ethnicities would grow from there, and our cultures would be different depending on where we lived. And that was not necessarily in the garden going to lead us to enmity. We can choose. We can choose another way to be in the world. We do not have to choose enmity between Germans and Lithuanians, or Jews and English or German. We can actually choose simply to be humans in a circle of humanity.
Thanks, Lisa. There are some more questions for Randy and Lisa in the Q&A, but we need to move on. And we'll continue our discussion of decolonization. How can we re-indigenize ourselves, but outside the white-black binary? And so Rob is going to talk about the Palestine-Israel conflict. And that issue, going beyond the white-black, is an issue of Orientalism, for me, of a different racial dynamic between the East and the West. And Edward Said wrote about Orientalism from a Palestinian perspective. And so we invite Rob now to share from his book, More Than Brothers.
Yeah, yeah. I wrote it. Let me explain what the book is about first before I kind of read it a little bit, so everybody has a little bit of a context. The book is a theological response to Christian Zionism. The idea being simple, that when people get confronted with Israel, Palestine, and what's going on, there's a natural reaction by most evangelicals, I just say many evangelicals, especially white evangelicals like myself. And that reaction is to say, no, there's nothing wrong there, because this is God's chosen people. God gave this land to the people of Israel. Genesis 12, verse 3 says so. Done deal, case closed, we're done, good day. And if they were confronted with the injustices in the land that were happening there, they suddenly now turn away from it, and they accept. So what I did is I wrote a theological response saying, if we understand the scriptures through the lens of Jesus, what does this mean that Jesus is the fulfillment? And I argue that Jesus is the fulfillment of the temple, he's the fulfillment of the land, and he's the fulfillment of the people of God, and that we don't look to the Jewish people per se as the fulfillment of God's promises, but through Jesus, the fulfillment of God's promises are there. And as a result, now we can start to say, okay, what's happening then in this land? What are the injustices that the Israelis are experiencing, and how do we respond to that, and how do we bring peace? And then what are the injustices that the Palestinians are experiencing, and how do we bring a response to that as well? So 1 second, I gotta let a dog out of the room. So, there you go. Sorry about that, but my dog likes to be with me, and all of a sudden decides it wanted to leave. So at the very end of the book, I say this: what do we do now? I say, the question is, what do we do now? Well, we get involved. And what does involvement look like? Well, first, I think we need to just get informed. I'm firmly convinced that awareness is the #1 factor we needed to change the situation on the ground. Getting informed can take a lot of different expressions. To begin with, I'd suggest that you personally get to know some people in your local area that are Jewish or Palestinians. You will not be disappointed. You might be stretched and challenged, but you will not be disappointed. They're wonderful people. And then you might find Arab or Jewish Christians and learn their stories, find out who they are, where they've come from. Ask them how you can better understand their culture and their way of life, and let them know that you care, and let them know why you care. Next, I'd recommend that you connect with people who actually live in the land. Get in touch with Israelis and Palestinian Christians in the Holy Land. One of my favorite people is Daoud Nassar. I can honestly say that in all my travels and teaching, I do not believe that I've met a man and a family that exemplifies the love of Christ more than Daoud and his family. Now, let me stop there. I did a webinar. I was on the webinar here yesterday talking about how to have hard conversations about Israel, Palestine. We did that last night. But the day before that, I did a podcast on my podcast, and we were discussing the situation with Daoud Nassar. Daoud and his brother were actually beaten severely at knife by about 15 different people. Someone came, this about 2 weeks ago, and someone came in and saw what was happening, and the people that were doing it fled, and so fortunately their lives were spared, but they were severely injured. So I encourage you to be praying for Daoud and his family. All right, next I say this: you can also get informed by a wealth of fantastic resources, and in the end of my book I have a bibliography there with some resources in it. And then finally, go and take a visit to the land. And this is one of the hard problems with the Israel-Palestinian issue, is that you really kind of need to actually go to the land and see what's happening there. And that's hard to do and it's expensive. And the problem is that many of the tours that lead you to the land are biased and problematic there, etc. And then finally, I say this, you can get active and find ways to get involved. The reality is that when it comes to Israel-Palestine, the church has been very complicit, and the United States has been very complicit as well. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm actually like the people you're trying to reach to, because I've grown up with a certain church perspective, and I understand that we could look at Palestinians, especially Palestinian Christians, as brothers and sisters of us. But a lot of the church is trying to see Israel's taking over of the land is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And so I was like, woo, it's a demonstration of God's reality. But you're arguing something different. Can you quickly sort of explain how Jesus is a fulfillment rather than the nation of Israel as we see now constituted being the fulfillment of prophecy?
Yeah. On a tangentially to that, one of the problems with looking at Israel as the fulfillment of these prophecies is that people that have that mentality, they often take the approach of saying, oh, look, and Armageddon's going to break out really soon. And look, there's war here and there's war there. And we actually get excited about war. And you think that's not what we should be doing at all. So it has a kind of a twisted perspective there. But the point, the way I argue for this point will be this, is I start off, I actually wrote 2 books. This book was actually the second book of one project. I decided to break it into 2 different books. And what I did in the first book, and then I repeated a little bit in the book, These Brothers of Mine, is I say, listen, here's something that we can start with that's easy to understand. That is, Jesus is the fulfillment of all God's promises about the temple. Because he says that, right? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. But the temple he was speaking of was his body. There's just simply no question that all the prophecies in the Old Testament that were pointing to the temple were actually pointing to Jesus. And so if we start with that and we explain how that's fulfilled in Jesus and what it means, therefore there's no more sacrifices because he's not only the temple, but he's the priest and he's the sacrifice, then people go, oh, okay, I understand this. And so now you can take that platform and say, okay, now let's look at the promises to the people of God. Oh, Jesus actually is Israel. He is the consummate Adam. He's the consummate son of Abraham. This is my beloved son, is what Abraham said about, I take your son, your beloved son, and sacrifice him. Oh, well, you won't do that, but actually I'll take my beloved son and I'll sacrifice him. So you see all this language that's about Israel that's fulfilled by Jesus. And then you do the same thing with issues of land, that Jesus is the bread of life. I'm the source of nourishment. The idea of Israel being a tree. Well, Jesus says, I'm the tree and you're the branches. And so we begin to say, oh, and the significance of that through Christ. And then I actually argue one more thought really quickly, and that is through the power of the Holy Spirit, we also recognize that we're temples of God now, right? I mean, Paul says, you are the temple of God because the Spirit dwells in us. And the call for the church now is to take the temple presence of God to the nation. So this is very missional. So instead of saying, let me just sit back and watch the news to see if I can see prophecies are being fulfilled, so maybe I can get raptured out of the way and bummer for everybody else, and yay, war and earthquakes and tragedies happening. Instead of saying that, we start going, oh, and God's now calling me to be his temple presence and to manifest that in holiness to the world. We have a mission to accomplish. It's not just like preaching the gospel, it's like living it out and doing gospel things there.
I understand how Jesus is a fulfillment of the temple and how we are the temple. What's the role of the land then? And what's the role of the Jewish people now in relationship to the land?
Yeah, and there's 2 really different questions there. The role of the land is this: even through the Eden is where God dwelt. Remember, so God creates the creation and God dwells in Eden. He calls Adam and Eve into Eden to be in his presence. The temple is the place where God is present. The whole idea was that God told Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then later on Moses, okay, I'm going to call you to this land because I'm going to manifest myself among you in that place. Now, as long as the temple is one building in one place, God's presence is limited to that one building in that one place. And in fact, only one person, the high priest, even gets to experience that once the building is there. So we realize that even throughout the Old Testament, who can build a house that can contain you? Even Solomon says that when he dedicates his temple. You can't be contained by this building. You begin to realize already that this isn't going to be sufficient because the whole earth will be full of the glory of the Lord, the psalmist says. So we see inklings throughout the Old Testament that this building's not actually going to be the long-term remedy or solution there. Jesus comes along and says, I am the presence of God. The Gospel of John says, we beheld his glory. And you begin to say, okay, more than one person saw his glory. And then as the Spirit indwells us and sends us out to the nations, now go ye therefore the nations, the church, the people of God, we take God's temple presence throughout the whole world. And as Paul says in Romans 4:13, that Abraham will be heir of the world, not heir of the land. And so you begin to see the place of the land is where God dwells. And the goal was the whole earth will be full of his glory. Now, the question of the Jewish issue, Jewish people, this is one of those questions I think we just simply need to be more delicate than we are. It seems that people are either all pro-Israel, and this is God's chosen people and the fulfillment of prophecies mentality, and therefore we let them do whatever they want. And if they're oppressing the Palestinians, they're God's people. We can't call them up to justice for that, which we should, because that's just a good thing to do. If you love somebody, you hold them accountable. But then you go to the other side and say, oh, well, the Palestinians are being oppressed and Israel's just a really bad people because look at they're the oppressors. They went from the Holocaust and being oppressed to now they're doing what was done to them. And we can't make these binaries like this, because the reality is that as soon as you take this, okay, look at the Palestinians and the suffering that's going on there, the danger of being anti-Semitic is real. We know that the Jewish people today still suffer from anti-Semitism. We saw it just a couple of weeks ago in the attack in Dallas. And so we have to be careful there. I would simply say this: the role of the Jewish people is the same role as it is for any one of us, whether you're American, whether you're African, whether you're Oriental, and that is everyone who calls on the name of Jesus Christ as Lord shall be saved. And so the call has always been to believe in Jesus Christ and who he is and confess him. And now your ethnic identity doesn't give you a one-up leg as kind of the whole idea. So I hope that clarifies it.
Thanks. So all of you, hopefully, like me, each author is sort of blowing my mind and making me shift how I think and see the world and read their books, because Rob's books is really illuminating and helpful and powerful in engaging this really deep-rooted conflict that impacts the entire world. So wrap up about this process of reclaiming and re-indigenizing, especially when we can't find our ancestors, and if we can't find a land. And James Baldwin, I wrote, said, we choose our ancestors, and we choose our ancestors to embody the values that we want to embrace. And so I'd just like to leave you with that as we seek to turn from a broken system, that God has given us resources, and that we do have ancestors that we can choose to claim and that he's given us to. So I'll pass it over to the next session. Thanks.